Good evening, friends. My name is Haley Bailey. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Chief Advancement Officer for the ACLU of Minnesota. I am a white woman with shoulder-length gray and brown hair wearing extra large tortoiseshell glasses and a black jumper. I'm so excited for you all taking time out of your evening to be with us to do some Know Your Rights around voting and elections. I would like to introduce who we have with us tonight. We have Brian Hu and Dahlia Stavapnos and David McKinney. Delia and David are staff attorneys with the ACLU of Minnesota. Brian is one of our legal clerks. We also have Teresa Lee, who is a staff attorney with the ACLU National Office, Paul Sullivan, who is a community organizer, and Becca Schell, who's one of our interns this year. So it's very great to have you all here. The way this is going to work is we're going to have a couple presentations. During the PowerPoint presentation, there'll be 3 times where we'll stop for Q&A. You can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, so pop your questions in there, but we will get to them as we get to the Q&A sections. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Teresa.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Haley. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Lee. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior staff attorney at ACLU National's Voting Rights Project. So all of my work is focused on voting rights. And so I'm thrilled to be with you today to situate today's work, today's Know Your Rights training that you'll be doing in the broader election safeguarding program across the ACLU, not just within Minnesota, but across the entire country. And so at the ACLU, we're proud to be one of many organizations who do this work, perhaps particularly situated because it's not just in one given place, but besides ACLU National, there's 54 separate affiliates across the country that engage in this work year-round through voter education, advocacy, litigation, et cetera. And so across the country, we're organizing, mobilizing, lobbying, litigating as part of the ACLU's largest ever election safeguarding initiative, investing both huge sums of time, huge sums of money to protect our right to vote, and importantly, to empower voters across the country to be able to participate fully in our democracy, ensuring that every eligible voter is able to cast their vote, that those votes are counted, and that the results of that fair election are certified and honored. And so, as I think you all know, as your presence here on a Wednesday evening probably illustrates, as we're facing unprecedented attacks on the right to vote, really at all levels of government, we need to protect the power of each individual voter and every community to ensure they're able to access the ballot. And that's really what we're focused on this year, and why we're organizing this volunteer mobilization and training program, of which this very training is part of that huge undertaking. But voter suppression doesn't just happen during the election season. It's not something that's confined just to even-numbered years when there's federal elections. Some legislatures are constantly trying to pass restrictive, discriminatory legislation, make it harder to vote, try and rig the rules to best hold on to their own power. And so for that reason, the ACLU also focuses on litigation, both ACLU National and with the litigators at ACLU state affiliates across the country are fighting for the right to vote in courtrooms year-round, odd-numbered years as well, and will be ready and are underway preparing to respond in an emergency fashion during this year's midterm elections as well. We're working to identify scenarios where the right to vote would be at risk and preparing ahead of time so that we can deploy as quickly as possible within the courts, and so none of us are caught flat-footed. This means making sure we know what the best legal arguments are for every risk scenario, what sort of showing we're going to need to make to get into court, having connections with the folks on the ground, the people actually being impacted. And critically, and I think this is one of the things that makes the ACLU special, we know that protecting voting rights doesn't just happen at the national level, right? Anti-democratic politicians exist at every level of government, and anywhere that that's happening, that's making it more difficult to vote is something that's critical for us to take on and be ready and willing to fight. And that's why ACLU affiliates are staffed in every state. There's 54 of them, so even more states even more than there are states, with lawyers based in state, own policy experts, own organizers, and most critically, people on the ground in every state ready to defend the right to vote. And we're not focused on any single tactic either, right? Like I may well be a litigator, but as Paul said, he's an organizer as well. And it's going to take advocacy, lobbying, litigation, mobilization, communications, boots on the ground, et cetera, all of us to do this work to protect our democracy. And the freedom to vote really is at the very foundation of our democracy. The history of voting rights in the United States is also the history of communities fighting to be heard. Throughout our country's history, the story really of our country's history is various groups facing legal, structural, violence-based barriers that are limiting equal access to the ballot. And many of the protections, for instance, that I rely on in the litigation context, were created in response to that actual history of struggle then in the United States. And one critical component of all this work is having an active and informed electorate. So when we know our rights, it's harder for them to be eroded, which is why it's great that you are all here. I thank so much the ACLU of Minnesota for having me join you, and I'll turn it back over to Haley, who will, I believe I'm supposed to turn it back over to her, get things underway into the next section of the program.
Thank you, Teresa, for joining us for that brief introduction. And I believe I have Paul Sullivan up first. And no, Becca. Is Becca up first?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. You were correct the first time. I'm doing the first two slides and then Becca. I apologize.
No worries, friends. That's why we do these things. I'm going to share my screen. Shoot. Apologies for the delay, friends. There we go. There we go. Take it away, Paul.
There it is. All right. Hello, my name is Paul Sullivan. I am an organizer with the ACLU of Minnesota. I use they, them pronouns. I am a white person with chin length, curly light brown hair. And I am here today to talk along with all these other amazing people about what are your voting rights this season? What are your rights to be aware of during this coming election season? I'm sure we've all seen, and I'm sure that you're here especially because of some of the rhetoric around that. It's been very heated. So we're here to kind of lower the temperature a little bit and make sure people know, hey, these are my rights. This is how I'm able to protect them and the rights of my loved ones and those in my community. So next slide, please. Before we start, a few quick disclaimers. Now, we obviously have some fabulous attorneys on this call, and we're very excited to get questions from to them as well. However, myself and Becca are not attorneys, so we always have to kind of have a bit of a disclaimer at the start of these presentations that we're not attorneys. However, we made this presentation with these attorneys, and we will have attorneys on hand to answer your questions. Number two, this presentation is educational. It is not legal advice. What that means is that it's not something that you can say, oh, my attorney advised me to do this in this specific situation. This is not a personalized one-to-one attorney relationship that we're talking about. This is general public education. And then thirdly, constitutional rights are defensive by nature. Now, the reason that we have this in here is because often when we do these presentations, people have 1,000 questions about, well, that's the law, but what if they break it? And we have seen lots of instances of government agents breaking the law, especially over the past winter in Minnesota. Constitutional rights, how they work are that they are defensive insofar that it's not like a bubble springs up and protects you from your rights being violated. Your rights still can be violated with the US Constitution in place. What it does is it provides you an avenue for redress later. That means that you can take it to court, that there is some sort of way for you to address the fact that your rights have been violated if they are violated. And of course, if the people who are you're interacting with know what the law says, they'll know that there are certain lines that they're not supposed to cross. So, saying that, we're gonna next slide, please. This presentation is in three buckets, if you will. You can kind of think of it as a flow chart. There's first your baseline voting rights. What are the rights that I have to vote in the 2026 midterm elections? What is the basic knowledge I need? And then secondly, we have a bucket talking about what are my rights at the polls and how do I protect them? What happens if something goes wrong? Who do I call? Who do I go to? And then thirdly, if that fails as well, we're going to have a section talking about how you can assert your rights during voting season. This is especially because people are worried, just like they have been this past year, about interacting with federal agents especially. So we're going to have a little bit of information on if sections 1 and 2 fail, how do I keep myself safe under section 3? How do I assert my rights with law enforcement? So to start off, section 1 is going to be handled by our amazing graduate summer intern, Becca Schill. So I'm going to hand it over to her.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Paul, and welcome again to everyone for joining us today. I'm Becca. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the graduate advocacy intern with ACLU Minnesota this summer. I'm a white woman. I have long red hair, and I will be taking you through section 1 of the presentation today. You may be familiar with some of this information already, so I appreciate your patience as I lay the groundwork for sections 2 and 3. We'll start with a bit of context for the state of voting rights in the U.S. today. Under the U.S. Constitution, the authority to control federal elections lies with Congress and the states. Despite this, multiple executive orders issued in the last 2 years have attempted to assert federal control over elections, and if acted on, they could potentially prevent eligible voters from exercising their right to vote. One example of this is an executive order from March of last year, which would require Americans to show documents proving their citizenship to be eligible to vote. This would create barriers to voting for people who don't have or can't easily access passports, real IDs, and birth certificates, as well as people whose current legal names don't match their citizenship documents. Another example of this is an executive order from March of this year, which directed the Department of Homeland Security to compile state citizenship lists that would include every eligible voter, in each state. It instructed the U.S. Postal Service to withhold mail ballots from voters not named on those lists. In practice, these actions could prevent many eligible voters from casting their ballots, with the right to vote being particularly impeded for low-income Americans, young people, people of color, married women, transgender people, recently naturalized citizens, and military personnel. Importantly, many lawsuits have challenged and are currently challenging these executive orders, and several courts have blocked the implementation of portions of the orders. Next slide, please. Fortunately for us, we can be hopeful about the state of voting rights in Minnesota. In the United States versus Simon, the Department of Justice sued Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon over his refusal to share Minnesota's voter registration database and voters' personal information, including their names, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, and incarceration history, with the department. If the Secretary of State complied with the federal government's demands, sensitive personal information of Minnesota voters would be available to the federal government, and many eligible voters could experience challenges when attempting to vote. In particular, justice-impacted Minnesotans who have had their right to vote restored but have not yet been added back to voter rolls could face difficulty when attempting to vote. This case is ongoing, but the Secretary of State has not handed over this data. Next slide. In addition, Minnesotans' voting rights have special protections under the Minnesota Voting Rights Act. The state-level Voting Rights Act protects Minnesotan voters from voter suppression and vote dilution practices, such as racial gerrymandering and other racist processes intentionally designed to weaken the voting power of voters based on race. The Minnesota Voting Rights Act does this by, 1, prohibiting government officials from engaging in any action or inaction that may obstruct the voting rights of a member of a protected class, including by impairing their ability to elect candidates of their choice. And 2, by making it easier to sue governments and officials for engaging in voter suppression and vote dilution practices by expediting pretrial and trial proceedings related to alleged violations of the Minnesota Voting Rights Act. While the Federal Voting Rights Act has protected Americans' voting rights for decades, recent changes to the federal law make it even more valuable that Minnesotans' voting rights are protected under state law. It's encouraging that our state cares deeply about protecting equity and accessibility in the voting process. Next slide. Why is this election important? You probably wouldn't be attending this if you didn't think it's important, but just in case you need any extra convincing, this year, every Minnesotan voter has the opportunity to vote for each official in the first two columns. So every position from U.S. Senator to state judge and justices. On top of this, some Minnesotans will have races for the people in the far right column, including county officials, city officers, school board members, and township officers. And they may also have local ballot questions. This means that the upcoming election will determine who represents Minnesotans in Congress, the state legislature, and many local governments. So it's very consequential despite not being a presidential election. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of voting in the 2026 midterm elections, we'll take a look at the election timeline. This is moving from left to right. Minnesotans have already begun to vote in the primary election through absentee voting, which started on June 26th. New in 2026 is something called early voting, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, and it starts on Friday, July 24th, which is this Friday in 2 days. The primary election is on Tuesday, August 11th for those voting in person on Election Day. The timeline for the general election follows the same pattern. That's in the primary election colors were yellow on the left there, and then the general election is in right on in green. The time frame is pretty similar. Absentee voting will start on September 8th, early voting on October 16th, and day of voting on Election Day, which is Tuesday, November 3rd. Write these dates down if you want to take a moment or put them in your phone's calendar. Otherwise, this will be recorded after the fact if you need to find this. Also, Secretary of State's website. I'll gush more about that later, but all this information is also on the Secretary of State's website, so you can definitely find it there. I'll just leave like 10 seconds to write them down if you need them. Sorry, Haley. Okay, move on. There are many ways you can register to vote as a Minnesotan. You can register to vote online through the Secretary of State's website 21 days or more before the election, so 3 weeks before the election or even before that. You can register to vote in person at your local election office before Election Day or at your polling place on Election Day. And you can also register to vote automatically when applying for renewing your Minnesota driver's license, instruction permit, or state ID card. These actions automatically initiate the voter registration process for eligible Minnesota voters. It involves an opting out option rather than an opting in option, as used to be the case in previous years prior to this 2023 automatic voter registration legislation. Which can increase voter access and improve voter access, and increase election security. Important to note about that third option, automatic voter registration. At this point in time, if you're hoping to vote in the primary election, that's probably not the option to plan for because it can take 4 to 6 weeks for the automatic voter registration process to be completed. So if you're wanting to vote in the primary election, those first two options, registering online or in person, will be your safest bets to make sure you can actually vote. For those who would like to vote but don't have a Minnesota ID, there are other ways to register. Next slide. Perfect. If you'd like to register to vote online, you will need that Minnesota ID number or your last 4 digits of your social security number. But if you want to register to vote in person, there are a lot more options for documentation that are optional for completing your voter registration. You can bring an ID with your current name and address, a photo ID plus a document with your current name and address if your current photo ID doesn't show your current address. An example of that would be like a residential lease or utility bill. You could bring another registered voter from your precinct who can verify where you live. You could bring a photo ID from your student housing list if you're a college student. You can bring a valid registration in the same precinct if you moved homes but still live in the same precinct as when you were previously registered to vote. You can bring a notice of late registration in the mail, or you can bring a staff person from a residential facility in which you live. Next slide. As I mentioned before, this will come up a few times, but all the information you need about registering to vote lives on the Secretary of State's website. If you're already registered, entering your address and name on the Check Your Registration page, which can be found kind of in the middle of that screenshot, will show you where your polling place is. If you want to take a moment to scan the QR code or write down the website URL, you may. I'll plug the Secretary of State a few more times in here just because there's a lot of really thorough information there. Okay, next slide, please. So there are a lot of options for voting before Election Day. It's just one of many ways to vote in Minnesota. So for Minnesota voters who would like to vote before Election Day, absentee voting and early voting are safe and secure methods of doing so. If you live in Minnesota, eligible voters do not need a reason to request an absentee ballot or vote early, so you can utilize any method you'd like for any reason. Um, this reference to the Secretary of State's website is related to finding out information about other ways to vote. So here you can request an absentee ballot, find early voting locations, track your ballot, and learn anything else about voting before Election Day. I'll give you a few moments again if you wanted to scan the QR code or enter this URL into your browser. It's pretty easy to navigate once you go to the Secretary of State's website, especially in the Elections and Voting tab. It's all pretty easy to get around in there. Okay, next slide, please. For many people, absentee voting is the first thing that comes to mind as an alternative to voting on Election Day. It's often referred to as voting by mail, but you can actually vote absentee either by mail or in person. If you choose to vote by mail, it's recommended to apply for your absentee ballot at least 2 weeks before the election to allow for time to receive the ballot and then return it back to the election office. For the primary election, that means applying for your absentee ballot before July 28th, which is next Tuesday. And for the general election, it means applying before October 20th. The online application asks for information such as your name, address, email, social security number, and Minnesota driver's license or ID number. It only takes a few minutes to complete. It's a really easy process. Once you've submitted the application, it'll be processed within a few days and a ballot will be sent to your home shortly after. If you fill it out and return it by mail or bring it to the elections office that sent the ballot before 5 p.m. on election day, you are good to go. Something to remember about absentee voting by mail is that you must have a witness or a notary sign the signature envelope that comes with your ballot. A witness can be any registered Minnesota voter. So as long as you can find someone to be your witness and sign there who's a registered Minnesota voter, you're good to go. In-person absentee voting is a very similar process, but it does not happen through the mail. Of course, it's in person. You'll identify the closest absentee voting location, which can be found on the Secretary of State's website, and go to that location to vote in person. You'll fill out an absentee application there, which requires your social security number or Minnesota ID number, receive your ballot, vote, and hand it back to the election official. Voting by mail, the specific part of absentee voting that's voting by mail is kind of shown here. You can apply for an absentee ballot online through the Secretary of State's website by clicking that button in the middle of the picture on the left. The image on the right shows what the application looks like. Notice that you can change the language of nearly anything on this website, including the absentee ballot request. So keep that in mind if you or someone you know would like to view these materials in a language other than English. Below the apply for an absentee ballot online button in the picture on the left, another method of submitting your absentee ballot application is described. That option, most commonly involves completing the application, printing it, and mailing or faxing it to your county election office. With that method, it's recommended to apply for your ballot at least 3 weeks before the election. The next slide is about tracking your ballot. So if you vote by mail, you have the ability to track your ballot, which means you can verify that you've applied, find out when your ballot was mailed to you, and confirm that your completed ballot was received by your local election office. It can take a few days for applications to be processed, so continue to check the status of your application and ballot if the ballot tracker doesn't locate it the first time. This one was a little confusing for me upon first learning about it, because pretty much any voting before election day is often referred to as early voting, but there's something new in Minnesota this year that's actually called early voting, capital E, capital V. It starts 18 days before the election, which is this Friday, July 24th for the primary election, and on Friday, October 16th for the general election. The process of early voting is very similar to voting in person on election day, but it's up to 18 days beforehand. So at any point between the first day of early voting, which for the primary again is this Friday, and the day before the election, you can visit your county election office during business hours, receive and fill out a ballot, and insert it into a ballot counter. And you can find the locations for in-person absentee voting and early voting are pretty much identical, but you can find that again, you probably guessed it on the Secretary of State's website. Next slide, please. This is a little redundant, but for me, it was kind of confusing to figure out the differences between in-person absentee and early voting. The main differences are when the voting method becomes available and where you put your ballot after you voted. So in-person absentee voting starts 46 days before election day. So that for the primaries already started. And the early voting starts 18 days before the election. And then in-person absentee voting involves handing your ballot to the election official, and early voting involves inserting your ballot into a ballot counter, much like voting on election day. They're both safe and secure ways of voting, but it just kind of depends what you would prefer to do. Next slide. This is my favorite one because I think it's so, so helpful. Make a plan to vote. Spend some time thinking about these questions and working towards answering them. If you want to answer them out loud at home to yourself, you certainly can. Will you be voting in the primary election? How will you be voting? Early, absentee, or day of? If you're voting by mail, have you requested your ballot? If you're voting in person, where do you cast your vote? Are you already registered to vote? And if not, what will you bring with you to the polls in order to register? Thinking about and answering these questions will help make sure that your voice is heard in this election. Next slide. And finally, for me, friends don't let friends skip elections. Make texting 3 others part of your voting plan. Think of 3 eligible voters you know, whether it be partners, friends, family members, or coworkers. It might seem silly, but if you'll oblige, say their names out loud. I'll do it with you, and hopefully I'm not the only one doing it. I'm gonna text Shannon, Andrew, and Emily. So 3 people I know I can keep accountable for voting. Send those 3 people a message encouraging them to vote before election day, or if you see them in person, talk to them about it. Let them know once you voted and ask them to text you after they voted. You can even make plans together to go to an absentee and early voting location in your county and vote at the same time. Make a day of it, make it fun. This tactic is more effective than government or nonprofit outreach, and it's a great way to hold yourself and your loved ones accountable for exercising your right to vote. Remember, friends don't let friends skip elections. And now I'll pass it back to Haley to facilitate our first round of Q&As.
Okay, David, I'm going to give this one to you to answer out loud. And it's, what if you receive an absentee ballot in the mail and then erroneously select candidates in both the Republican and the Democrat columns? Do you need to turn the ballot in when you go in to vote? Or are there other things that you need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much for the question. The short answer to that is you shouldn't vote twice. And you can allow that mail-in ballot to be spoiled. In other words, you should disregard it and discard it in a safe location, and then you should show up to vote on the in the polls for whomever you choose. That's the best way to handle that situation. Now, the Secretary of State's office tracks all ballots and who they're going to. So there is a way for the secretary to know that you have, voted in person versus the mail-in ballot that you initially had requested.
Thank you, David. I'm going to give it 5 more seconds for any other questions on this part. Okay, and seeing none, I will bring us back to our presentation. And Paul, I believe that you are up.
All right. Thank you so much for helping answer that one, David. I guess Becca just did such a thorough job that there were no questions. Next slide, please. Now that we've talked a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how do you vote, we're going to move into a section talking about what are your rights when it comes to voting. I always like to tell people we all have rights, but they're no good if you don't know them, because then you can't assert those rights. So when you are trying to vote in Minnesota, it's pretty simple who can vote. If you are over 18 years old, if you're a US citizen, and if you've been a resident in Minnesota for at least 20 days before the election, you can vote. And that includes people who are on felony probation parole. That's a new thing as of 2023. That includes people who are naturalized US citizens. If you are a citizen, you're 18, and you're a Minnesota resident, you can vote. The exceptions to this, there are a few limited exceptions to this. One of them is if you are currently in prison. Mind you, that's not jail, that is specifically prison. Number two, if you are under a guardianship that explicitly revokes your right to vote. Not every guardianship does this. It has to be very specific that you don't have the right to vote. Or third, if you've been determined to be legally incompetent by a court of law. So, in general, chances are if you're here, if you're reading this, if you're over 18 and you're a citizen, you probably have the right to vote. Obviously, check this list, but it doesn't disqualify many people in Minnesota. Next slide, please. Now, some more rights that you have. Minnesota is a great state for this. It was one of the first, I believe, to pass this. You have the right to register to vote on election day. What that means is that there's no deadlines that you have to keep in mind about how early do I have to register? If I miss that deadline, do I miss my right to vote? Nope. In Minnesota, as long as you can get to the polls on election day, you can register on the spot and vote. Another right that you have the right to take time off of work to vote. Your employer can't say, nope, you don't get to go vote today. We need you on the shift right now. They can't require you to use your PTO, your personal time. They can't require you to use like sick time or vacation time to vote. If you're on the clock, you still should be able to go vote in Minnesota. Another one that's really important that I'm not sure how many people know about, if you are in line to vote physically at the polls, at the time that the polls close, which is 8 p.m. across the state, you have the right to stay in line until you cast your vote. So even if you get in line at 7:59, as long as you are in line by 7:59, you can still vote even after the polls close. Of course, you also have the right to bring children to your polling place. I know that finding childcare can be hard, especially if it's first, going to vote, going back, going to find your job again. You also have the right to take a sample ballot or other reference materials into the voting booth. So you don't have to walk in there, see the list of names and be like, oh, I have no idea who these people are. I don't know who to vote for. Congratulations, you have the right to have some sort of reference so that you don't have to just completely blind vote. And then lastly, one that we're going to talk a good amount more about is you have the right to vote without intimidation or interference in Minnesota. But we're going to put a pin in that for just 2 seconds, and we're going to talk about one more right on the next slide. Importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about electioneering. Basically, electioneering is when somebody is trying to convince you to vote for a certain person or a certain ballot measure, campaign, etc., within 100 feet of a polling place. Under Minnesota law, it is illegal for this to happen. So that means people can't go in within 100 feet of a polling place wearing like a t-shirt that says vote for so-and-so. They can't be wearing, badges that are relevant to the things on the ballot. They can't be wearing buttons, stickers like that, etc. If it's something that is on the ballot, it can't be within 100 feet of the polling place. And in general, through all of this, keep in mind that that 100-foot line is generally where they try to keep people out that aren't going to be directly involved in voting. So if you're not going into the polling place to vote, you're probably going to catch some flack from the poll workers for being within 100 feet of the polling place, unless it's a specific situation. Next slide. Now, intimidation and interference. We've all heard a lot of the rhetoric that's been going around, especially under this administration, about, the potential for like having federal agents at the polls or having, people watching the polls, things like that. So we want to be super clear at the ACLU, nobody has the right to intimidate or threaten you while you are voting or registering to vote. And when I say nobody, that doesn't mean, just people who are citizens. Law enforcement does not have the right to intimidate you. The military does not have the right to intimidate you. This is one of the beautiful things about living under the constitutional democracy that we have. And furthermore, any person who intentionally prevents or attempts to prevent you from voting or registering to vote, that is a crime. So you have that right to vote. Do not let anybody dissuade you from exercising that right to vote. Next slide, please. Now, intimidation and interference, I know these are big words. So let's get into like, what does it actually mean? Now, if you look at the statutes, there's a few different things that can count as this. One of the big ones is, if you run into somebody who's aggressively questioning people about like, what is your citizenship? Are you a citizen? Or like, have you committed a felony? Should you be voting? Anything like that. If the manner is intended to interfere with your right to vote, that is an example of intimidation or interference. Obviously, another one is if you fraudulently present that, oh yes, I'm an election judge. That is an example of breaking these laws as well. Spreading false information about like who can vote, like what are the requirements to vote, where do you vote, when can you vote? Those are all things that also fall under this. So like you can't text your neighbor and say, hey, for you voting is on, Friday instead of Tuesday. Things like that. Displaying false or misleading signs about voter fraud and related criminal penalties. Those are things that are also under this intimidation and interference. And then other forms of harassment, and especially with an eye towards non-English speakers and voters of color, because these are communities that have been pretty routinely targeted by some of these forms of intimidation and interference. All of these things are, to various degrees, under federal or Minnesota law crimes. So next slide. Now, one thing that I know people are probably a little bit nervous about is law enforcement at the polls, whether that's the police or ICE or whoever. It's very important, let's be clear, Minnesota state law prohibits any person from intimidating or interfering with people engaged in the voting process, whether they are military or law enforcement or not. Now, let's get a little more granular. If we're talking about peace officers, so often that means the police or sheriffs or things like that, peace officers are not allowed to come within 50 feet of a polling place except for two very specific reasons. First is if they've been summoned by an election judge to restore the peace. So like if somebody is coming into a polling place and they're, engaging in intimidation or something like that, another way breaking the law, that is an instance where the sergeant at arms in the polling place can call a peace officer in to deal with that. The only other reason that a peace officer should be in the polling place is if they are personally voting or if they are personally registering to vote. So, obviously like a sheriff can walk in and cast his own vote. Next slide. Now, let's talk a little bit about federal agents at the polling places. Federal law is very clear about this. It does criminalize election interference by the federal military and any sort of deployment of federal troops or other armed federal agents to the polls. So if you see federal agents showing up at the polls armed, that is a crime under federal law. That one's really pretty clear cut. Now, if that were to happen, you would be well within your rights constitutionally to document those activities. If they're in there, you are able to photograph or record them via video. In general, polling places discourage photography and video recording. However, again, this is your constitutional right. If you're able to, yes, it is your constitutional right. Next slide. Now, a brief word on poll challengers. There's a lot of rhetoric, again, coming from this administration about, we got to have people watching the polls. We got to have people challenging people who shouldn't be voting. I want to talk a little bit about like what exactly poll challengers are, because it's actually a very specific group of people. There are really only three kinds of people that can challenge a voter's eligibility in the state of Minnesota. First is an election judge, because that is their job. Secondly is if it's an eligible voter who is from the same precinct. So if I lived in the same precinct as Haley and I knew, oh, Haley's not a citizen, then I could say, hey, I don't think that Haley is allowed to vote. Or then lastly, appointed challengers. This can come in a few different flavors. The most common one is that challengers are appointed by political parties to be at different polling places. Sometimes there are other ones like the Department of Justice sometimes appoints them, things like that. One thing that's really important, though, is that for all of these, poll challengers can only contest eligibility if they have personal knowledge of a voter's eligibility. That doesn't mean, oh, that person, I heard them speak Spanish, I'm going to challenge them, or that person, has brown skin, I'm going to challenge them. They have to personally know that X person is not eligible to vote for a specific reason. So like if I saw imagine Becca was 17 instead of whatever age she is and walked into the polling place, I could say, okay, I know that Becca's 17. She shouldn't be voting. That's an example of a valid challenge. However, challengers cannot interact directly with a voter, even if they are challenging their right to vote. The way that they do that is it has to be via writing and it has to be with the election judges. They are not allowed to interact directly with that voter. Next slide. Now, there's a lot of information, a lot of different rights that we have to keep in mind. The next question, of course, is what happens if something goes wrong? Who do I call? Who do I contact? We're a big fan here at the ACLU of acronyms and sort of mnemonics because it's an easier way to kind of remember complicated legal information. So a mnemonic that we use to teach this sort of ladder of escalation, if you will, if your voting rights are infringed upon, is this phrase, EJ plus 3. Now, EJ plus 3 basically means that if you experience or witness challenges, the first thing you do is you alert an election judge. This is pretty easy if you're at a polling place. You just find somebody who's working there and tell them, hey, this is something that I saw, or this is something that I experienced. I think it violates my rights. Now, the next thing that you do, and we would encourage you to do this even after talking to an election judge, is called these 3 numbers. First, your local election official. Now, you might note election official is capitalized here. Election official isn't just generically anybody who works at the elections. In this context, it means the specific individual in your county that is the election official that is appointed to oversee the elections there. So election official here is a specific person, not just anybody. Then secondly, the Minnesota Secretary of State's office. This is, we're going to have numbers for all of these in just a second. They're the ones that are in charge of the elections. And then lastly, 866-R-VOTE, which is a voter hotline that is national and the ACLU takes a part in. So first slide. Now, once again, the first call is to your election official. Like I said, that's a person that is a specific person. They can answer questions as well. But if you have any encounters with law enforcement, if you have any other people that are trying to intimidate you, that's the person that you call. So just so that everybody has these numbers instead of having to scramble if something does happen, we have these little stops put in here so that people can scan this and put the number of your election official in your phone now. So I'm going to give people 10 seconds, 15 seconds to look up that number and then write it down or put it in your phone, whatever you need to do. Okay, I think next slide, Haley. Now, once you've called your election official, the next call that you're going to make is to the Secretary of State. Again, the Secretary of State is in charge of Minnesota's elections statewide, and they have a control hub where they, disperse information. They, send concerns up and down the line, and also they're able to track if there are violations and help them get addressed. There's normal business hours, 8 a.m., 4 p.m., Monday through Friday. I believe there are extended hours around the election specifically. I know they at least staff up around the elections, but that's the second call you're going to make. So I'm going to give everyone 10 seconds again to put the Secretary of State's number in your phone so that, again, if the time comes, you don't have to scramble to find this later. So if you're in the metro area, it's 651-215-1440. If you're outside of the Twin Cities metro area, it's the greater Minnesota number, 1-877-600-8683. So I'm going to give people 10 seconds to put this in your phone. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third number in this EJ+3 formulation is 866. 866 is a national project that has volunteer attorneys from across the country that are able to answer any sort of questions or relay any concerns. The ACLU of Minnesota has its attorneys participate in 866 R vote on election day so that they can help with any sorts of concerns that are raised. As you can see, there are a whole bunch of different languages available. The English one has the famous 866 number, but then there are Spanish, Arabic, a variety of Asian languages. One number that we actually added in because it's not covered by 866 Our Vote because it's a national project is Somali. For Somali specifically, we actually recommend people call Care Minnesota. They have attorneys and they have a hotline for rights violations. Also, I should have mentioned earlier, the Secretary of State's hotline has multiple languages available, including Somali and Hmong. So those are all options when it comes to calling for help if there's some sort of issue or if you have questions. So I'm going to give everyone 10 more seconds to put the number in one more time. Find the relevant number for you and put it in your phone. Okay, next slide. Now, when something happens at the polls, does it do much good to just call somebody and say, ah, help, my rights have been infringed? Ah, click. No, that does not really help. You need specifics. So one thing that we recommend, and this is a practice that came out of this winter, is remembering the acronym SALUTE. I believe this is an acronym that was first used by the United States military, and the idea behind it is that it gets accurate, useful, usable information to the person you're talking to. So when you're doing your EJ+3, the election judge, the county official, the election official, the Secretary of State in 866, keep this information in mind. First, like if you're interacting with, like, say, federal agents, first, how many people, or maybe you're being harassed by someone just in community, how many people are harassing you? Activity, what are they doing? Are they just calling you bad names? Are they blocking your way into the polls? Location, know where you are, what's the intersection or something. Uniform, which doesn't necessarily mean specifically uniform. It can just mean what are they wearing. What are they wearing wouldn't make as good of a snappy acronym, I suppose. Time, when's it happening? What's the date? And then lastly, equipment. Do they have something like on them that is making it more of a threat? Do they have a weapon? All of these things are relevant because they will interact directly with election law. For example, if they have a weapon and they're 100 feet from a poll, less than 100 feet from a polling place, that is a crime. So this is all relevant and useful information to keep in mind so that you can pass it on to people. Next slide, please. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also plug for you to contact the ACLU of Minnesota as well. We like to kind of think of it as an added step on top of EJ+3, because EJ+3 is what's going to get you immediate help. Contacting the ACLU of Minnesota is what's going to get you help later down the line. If your rights have been infringed and the Secretary of State or your election official or somebody isn't able to actually help protect your rights, that's when you contact us and we get involved. We have a few ways to do that. The first is we have sort of a federal intake that we set up this past winter during Operation Metro Surge. And that's aclu-mn.org/ice-feds-forum. And then we also have a general intake line, which is aclu-mn.org/request-legal-assistance. Either of these will get your case in front of our legal team, and then we'll be able to evaluate it and see if there's something that we can do. So remember, EJ+3, election judge, then election official, Secretary of State, 866, and then please contact the ACLU as well so that we can keep track of those violations. Next slide. All right. I think now I'm going to hand it back to Haley for another quick Q&A.
Fantastic. So get your questions in the box. So I think, David, this one could be answered by you. And the question is, can the National Guard be called in, or is Governor Walz and the Minnesota election team thinking about how to protect polls if instigators try to disrupt voting at all or some of the polls in Minnesota? And then just maybe at the end, remind people how far away candidates and their supporters need to be from the polling place and exactly what the polling place entails. You're muted.
Okay, hi. Does that work?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I think the question is around whether Minnesota, whether there's some protections for instigators disrupting the polls, and the answer to that is yes. The under Minnesota law, a if there is interference or intimidation that occurs at the polls, the law enforcement can be called in. A peace officer can be called in to keep the peace, and that's going to be dependent on the a local election official or the election judge on site who would be able to make that call as to whether they need peace officers to show up. I don't know about the plan that Governor Walz specifically has, but I do know that in past elections, my own experience has been that election officials on the ground have been very responsive and able to make those calls when necessary. A individual who isn't voting needs to be 100 feet from the polling place at all for all times. Although I will say that in any sort of intimidation or interference can occur even when individuals are beyond that that distance, and law enforcement can be called in to prevent or to squelch any attempts to interfere or intimidate around the polling place, but even far outside, far beyond that perimeter.
Thank you, David. And we might have some lawyers on the phone with us because the next question is very much about the polling place. Do you mean the front door of the building, the entire building? What actually counts as that 100-foot perimeter?
Yeah, so I mean, so it generally means the sort of the distance right outside the door of the polling location. It can extend to the parking lot of the polling location, but uh, I, I don't. I think that that probably is the best we can do in terms of the actual distance.
Thank you for that. And then we have a question about power of attorney. So if you can answer this, please feel free to. Can I request an online absentee ballot for a person I have power of attorney for? It asks for his signature.
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that question. I saw it and I thought it was a really good question. I don't. There probably is an answer maybe on the Secretary of State's website to that question, but I haven't had this one posed to me before, and wouldn't want to guess at the answer.
Thank you for that, David. And then another question. What can we do as ordinary citizens to help protect our neighbors and community members with their right to vote on election day?
Is that one for me as well, Haley?
That is for you, or Paul, if you feel that you have some, you can come off as well.
Yeah. So, Paul, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're going to actually talk about that a little bit in the next section, but a lot of what you're able to do to help protect your neighbor's ability to vote is making sure you're going out into community and talking about these rights, making sure people know, hey, if you are a U.S. citizen, you're over 18, you have the right to vote, and this is what you do if somebody challenges that. There are also a number of organizations out there, depending on where you are in the state, that are trying to do like souls to the polls or other sorts of things like that, trying to help encourage and make sure people can exercise that right to vote. Really, I think the best thing to do is, be vigilant during this election season, be in touch with your neighbors, and make sure that they know what their rights are. But we'll talk more about that in the next section. I don't know if David, you have anything to add on top of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That it'd be really good if you and I don't know if Paul you covered this in this section or in the next section, but if everyone took sort of responsibility of at least three other people to ensure that they were that they were able to exercise their right to vote along with yourself, I think that would go a long way. And doing it early, don't wait to the day of election to check in on folks and to make sure they have everything that's needed for them to vote. I think that's the best way to ensure that we have, full participation and that everyone can exercise their rights safely and within their means and ability to do so.
And I think the next question, I am going to ask it, but I don't know if we have an answer to this question because we wouldn't want to speculate on what is allowable. But do election judges have the right to ask federal agents to leave? And if they don't, can local law enforcement remove them from election place?
So, election judges' role is to ensure that the election process at the polls is carried out smoothly, safe, and efficiently. And so, to the first point of the question as to whether election judges can ask federal agents to leave if they feel like their presence is interfering with the safe and effective election process. Certainly, they can do that. Um, uh, I think to the other question whether federal agents will leave or whether they have a purpose to be there is sort of an open question. That's going to be sort of fact dependent and specific on the polling location and the reason that officers would give for their presence at the particular polling location. So to your point, we don't need to speculate about what reasons they may offer, but certainly no federal agent has just the right to be in a polling place just because. So they have to have a legitimate reason to be there, and that election judges have to. Their role is to ensure the safe and efficient process for elections.
Thank you, David. And with that, we are going to move on to the third part of our presentation. So bear with me as I share my screen again. And there we go.
All right, thank you so much, Haley. Waiting for it to show up. There we go. All right, next slide. Okay, so we've talked about the nuts and bolts of voting. We've talked a little bit about what do you do if something goes wrong? Who do you call? Remember that EJ+3. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what if that also goes wrong? What are some threats around the midterms and how can you protect your rights out in community? Before we talk about that, though, remember how I talked about cooling the temperature a little bit when it comes to this election? We very much want to do that with this because we've talked with experts when it comes to voting, when it comes to, the ACLU has kind of been covering this lane for a very long time. One thing that we really want to emphasize is that there is a lot of threats going around. Very few of these threats are likely to fully or even partially materialize on election day. for the vast, vast majority of voters, it's just going to be a normal election. Keep in mind the reason behind a lot of these threats. A lot of the threats, the goal is the threat itself. If that rhetoric is able to depress turnout, especially for vulnerable communities, communities of color, stuff like that, that is the goal of that rhetoric. So the best thing that you can do in the face of this is keep calm and go vote. It's something that you need to just sort of assume, yes, I'm going to go ahead and have a normal election. If as many of us do that as possible, there's going to be most of us that is truly the case for. Next slide. Now, we are still going to talk about some of the threats that have been made. The federal government, as I'm sure all of you are aware, has threatened to deploy federal agents to polling places this election season. However, the experts at the ACLU, and we've consulted with many, in the voting rights space as well as the anti-authoritarian expert space, most of the ACLU experts anticipate that this is actually not going to be a huge issue, having federal agents at the polling places. It is much more likely that if federal agents are involved in this election, that they will be deployed into communities to create a chilling effect on voting. So that will look kind of similar, like it may have, over this past, few years, but especially like this past winter. If in the case of, say, ICE, for example, having ICE sort of out in community more is more likely, frankly, than having federal agents at the polling places. Because, as we've talked about, there are some pretty strict laws about having federal agents in polling places. They can't really get over that. Let's be really clear. Voting is a right if you're a U.S. citizen and you're over 18, like we talked about. That is regardless of national origin. That is regardless of your ethnicity. That is regardless of your race. That is regardless of the primary language you speak. If we're going to protect this right in 2026, we need to know our rights outside of the polling places as well, your rights out in community. So the next section is going to talk a little bit about how do you assert those rights out in community if you run into some sort of law enforcement during the election season. Next slide. Now, this is one of those sort of mnemonics that I was talking about. You've got EJ plus 3. Now I want to introduce to you 4 plus 2. 4 plus 2 is a mnemonic that you can use to remember your voting right, or excuse me, your rights when you are interacting with law enforcement. I always like to tell people it's one thing to know your rights intellectually. It's a very different thing to know your rights when there is some sort of law enforcement officer standing right next to you, asking you questions or shouting at you, Lord forbid. When that happens, a lot of that knowledge that might be in your brain is gone suddenly. So trying to really get some sort of mnemonic to memorize it is incredibly useful and important. So 4 plus 2, this means your 4 basic things that you can always say to law enforcement to protect your rights, and then 2 things that are just as fundamental, but a little bit more situation specific, whether you deploy them. So next slide. Part of this training, especially when we do it in person, is not just trying to get this into your head, but get this into your system, get it into your body. And a big part of that is saying it out loud. If you've never had to assert these rights out loud, just the act of saying them physically for the first time can be a bit of a hang up because you have so many things going through your body, so much stress in that moment. So I encourage everybody who is at home to, I know it might sound silly, but I encourage you to say these rights out loud along with me. Okay? I'm going to say it and then repeat it so that everybody has a chance to say it. Number 1, am I being detained? Am I being detained? Number 2, I want to remain silent. I want to remain silent. Number 3, I don't consent to a search. I don't consent to a search. Number 4, I want to speak to an attorney. I want to speak to an attorney. Next slide. Now, that was the 4. This is the plus 2. These are just as fundamental of rights. However, like I said, when you use them is a little bit more context specific. For example, the first one depends on you having a door between you and the person that you're talking to. So the first one is, I don't consent to your entry. Everybody? I don't consent to your entry. And then number 2 is, I have the right to record in public. I have the right to record in public. Now, again, that one's also situational because if you're not in public, that's not necessarily a right that's covered. But if you are in a public space, if you're recording something that is in plain view, that is your right. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get a little bit more granular about these sort of rights baseline. Firstly, you always have the right to remain silent. But importantly, you should say it out loud if you want to exercise it. So you're going to say out loud, I want to remain silent. Everybody, I want to remain silent. Now, if you're stopped by a law enforcement officer and they continue to ask you questions, this is where you bring in that next right. I want to speak to an attorney. Everybody, I want to speak to an attorney. Now, when possible, it is incredibly important that you assert these rights out loud. The reason for this is that in the United States, your rights are most legible, as it's called, to the court when they have been spoken out loud. So that means later, if you're in court, you can say, I asserted my rights out loud. And it's harder for whoever you're up against, whatever law enforcement agency, to say, I don't think they did. I don't remember them ever saying anything. If you said it, then you can say later in court, yeah, I said that out loud. They probably heard that. I can say that without perjuring myself. Now, next, to ask for your identification, an officer needs to be able to articulate a reasonable suspicion of a crime or a violation. So if an officer stops you and asks to see your ID, it's always a good idea to ask them, why have you stopped me? Everybody, why have you stopped me? Now, very important to this one, if you are a US citizen, you do not have to present proof to a law enforcement officer of your citizenship. That's not a thing. Even if you're, a brown person walking around, if you're a citizen, you don't have to present proof that you're a citizen. That is your right in the United States. Next slide. Now, there's a few exceptions that we're going to briefly cover. First is if you are arrested by federal immigration enforcement, so ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, etc., you do have the right to an attorney. Any arrest in the United States, you have the right to an attorney. However, if it's immigration enforcement, the government does not have to provide you with one. That is because immigration is civil law. Criminal law in the United States, if you're charged with a crime, you are given an attorney, or you have the right to be given an attorney. When it's civil, however, they do not have to provide you with one. Number two, in Minnesota, you do not have to provide your name to law enforcement unless they suspect you of a crime. That is because Minnesota is not what's called a stop and identify state. So if I were a police officer and I stopped Dahlia and said, hey, show me your ID. Why? Just because I said so. Dahlia would not have to do that. I would have to say, hey, you are being detained. Show me your ID. Once that detain process is started, that's when that is initiated. But in some other states, it's a little different, especially for us, neighboring states, North Dakota and Wisconsin, they are stop and identify states. So they don't have that same protection of being able to say, hey, I don't have to give you anything until I'm being detained. If law enforcement asks to search you, you always have the right to say no. However, if they suspect that you have a weapon, and in general, they will say that, they do have the right to pat you down. So it's still important that you say that right out loud, but they will probably give you a pat down, even if you say your rights out loud, I don't consent to a search. Now, very important for all of this, and honestly a little bit absurd, but it is how it works. If you speak at any point in an interaction with a law enforcement officer after you've been detained or before, you need to reassert that right to remain silent. Because if you do speak, you say, I have the right to remain silent, and then, oh, by the way, can I go use the restroom? Officers can take that as, all right, they decided to speak. That means that they're deciding to waive that right because they decided to open their mouth. So it might seem a little bit childish, kind of like time in, time out. But if you want to keep that right to remain silent, you do need to reassert it after you speak. Next slide. Okay, because we're talking about federal agents especially, we're going to talk a little bit about warrants. And this is a compressed version of a longer training. So we have more information on our website for all of this information. But in general, there's two flavors of warrants to be aware of. The first is a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Basically, that allows officers to enter your house and search an area listed or arrest an individual that's been listed. An administrative warrant, however, does not allow this. If it's not signed by a judge, it does not get over that Fourth Amendment hurdle for unreasonable search and seizure. They cannot enter without permission. Just so you can kind of see what this looks like. Next slide. These are examples of judicial warrants. As you can see, there's kind of two checks that you're looking for. Check number one, up at the top, you can see that it says court, specifically in this case, United States District Court. So that's check one. It is in fact issued by a court. And then check two is you're going to look down at the bottom and see, is there a space for a judge to sign? Now, we've seen federal agents, ICE specifically in a lot of the cases, do lots of illegal things. We have yet to see them forge a judge's signature. That is a line that they have not yet crossed to our knowledge. So it is reasonable if it says judge's signature and it is signed, it is reasonable to assume that that's check number two. Yes, this is a judicial warrant. You do have to open the door. Next slide. To contrast, this is an administrative warrant. As you can see at the top, does it say court? No, it does not. It just says Department of Homeland Security or U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then down at the bottom, it's not filled out, but you can see that there is not a space for a judge to sign. So there's nowhere that a judge could have signed this, which means that's strike one, strike two. This is not a judicial warrant. You do not have to open a door for this. Now, again, we're talking about all of these things because, like I said, one of the biggest threats that we're thinking is probably most likely when it comes to the election is having federal agents out in community. So that's why we're kind of covering these again. Next slide. Two situations that we're going to go over super briefly for you with this election season in the event that you do interact with federal law enforcement. The first is at your home. This is kind of a baseline because your rights are strongest when you're at home. You have a door between you and officers. So there's some very simple things that you can ask. If federal agents show up to your home, first you're going to ask, why are you here? And then next you're going to ask, which agency are you with? This is important because, unfortunately, ICE officers have a habit of lying. We've heard everything at the ACLU from, oh, it's the Amazon delivery driver. I'm not kidding. That is an actual example. To, oh, yep, this is the local police department. This is where you're going to ask for them to show a badge because ICE is not going to be walking around with fake badges that say Ramsey, County Sheriff or like, St. Paul Police or something like that. That's something that they can't really fake. And then the next thing you're going to ask is, do you have that signed judicial warrant? If they do have that, you're going to ask them to slide it under the door, hold it up to a window or peephole so you can see it. Importantly, you're not going to open the door to do this. The reason is that if you do open the door, even just a little, later they could argue that you consented to them entering because you opened the door for them. I know that's ridiculous. One thing that I like to kind of joke about is that often ICE agents can be a little bit like vampires. There's rules that they're supposed to follow, but also if there are tiny little loopholes that they can find, they will take advantage of it. So if they don't have that judicial warrant, that's where you go straight to, I do not consent to your entry. And again, a judicial warrant that's valid needs to be issued by a court, has to be signed by a judge within the last 14 days, and all the information has to be correct. There can't be a typo in the name, there can't be a typo in the address. All of it has to be correct, otherwise it is not valid. And you have the right to refuse their entry. Next slide. Now, another common situation is while you're out and about this election season is if you're pulled over by a federal agent driving. It's going to be a pretty similar script. Why have you stopped me? Which agency are you with? Please show your badge. And then the next question, which is a little different than if you're, in your house, and this also applies to if you're out and about, am I free to go or am I being detained? Which is, again, that's those 4+2 rights that we were talking about earlier. This is, especially when you're in a vehicle, a bit of a challenging situation because we've seen where ICE agents that have pulled people over have sometimes been told, am I free, if you say, am I free to go? And they don't have an answer, then, people have just driven away safely. Sometimes they won't even say like, oh, yep, you're being detained. And they've just, arrested people. It is unfortunately a situation, as with some of these rights, that you do have to do a bit of a personal risk assessment. always, if you're able and if you're in a situation where it makes sense to assert your rights, that makes everybody safer because the result is that law enforcement doesn't expect immediate compliance and immediate waiving of your rights. So if you're able to, that's something that I would personally encourage at least. However, obviously, please take your own situation into account. Now, if an agent asks to search your car, this is where you're going to ask, do you have that signed judicial warrant? Hold it up to the window. If they don't produce it, this is where you say, I do not consent to you searching my vehicle. And importantly, even if they do these things and violate your rights, it's still important to say things like, I don't consent to your search. I don't, I want to remain silent. Because again, even if those rights are violated, you can then say in court, I asserted this right, and then they violated it. Lastly, if you're a passenger, you have to assert your rights independently. If you're, it's not just the driver that covers the entire car. If I'm in a car with Becca and I get pulled over, Becca can ask, am I free to go? And if they say yes, she can get out of the car and leave if she wants, for example. Next slide. Now, this gets especially to that question earlier about like, how can we help our neighbors during this election season? How can we help keep them safe? The biggest tool in your toolbox, along with in telling people about your rights, is your First Amendment. You have the First Amendment right to film anything that is visible in public, and you have the First Amendment right to say things in public. So as long as you're not obstructing law enforcement activities, you can film, you can shout things, you can blow whistles, as long as you're not obstructing law enforcement. One thing that we are going to say as a best practice, however, is that it is a good idea to stay at least 8 feet away from federal law enforcement officers or any law enforcement officers at all times. And if you're given an order, comply with it. I always tell people, if they tell you to back up while you're filming, you say, okay, you move your phone so that you can see your feet and narrate, I am moving back. And then you can return to what you're filming. So it is important that you do still follow the law even while you are using your First Amendment right to document in public. Next slide. And next, another best practice we're going to briefly cover is self-identification. Now, like I said earlier, it is not required that you carry documents that verify your citizenship status if you are a US citizen. You do not have to do that. That is your right. However, and also that includes while you're voting, you don't have to bring that around. However, if you feel like you would be more secure if you do have those documents, it can be an okay idea to carry them anyway. A lot of it does boil down to that personal risk assessment. If you feel like you can confidently assert your rights, then you don't necessarily need to carry it. But if you feel like you want that insurance policy, if you will, especially if you're a naturalized citizen, it can be useful to carry it anyway. A lot of it is going to boil down to what you're comfortable with and how able you feel in a moment to be able to assert your rights, especially if you're a BIPOC Minnesotan or if you're an immigrant. Next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about one last best practice, which is biometrics. Now, technically, law enforcement needs a warrant to search your phone. That includes whether it's unlocked with your thumbprint, with your face, or with a code. However, if you do have biometrics enabled, and this is something that we've seen this past winter, it is much easier for law enforcement to unlock your phone, whether they have a warrant or not. Again, technically, it is not legal for them to do this, but it is much easier if you don't have if you have biometrics enabled. So I always try to recommend to people, if you're out and about and you're worried about any sort of interaction with any kind of law enforcement, best to turn it off. Just have a code on your phone. Next slide. Now, these are a few quick resources as you're out and about in community to be able to help keep your neighbors safe this voting season. The first is immigrant hotlines for interactions with federal law enforcement. There are 2 major ones in the state of Minnesota. One is Minarca, and the second one is Copal. These are both lines that will get you rapid responders. Once they've verified the information, remember that salute that we talked about earlier, the salute acronym, then they will send trained observers to be able to document what's happening and make sure that people's rights are protected. If you're in a situation where somebody you know needs immigration legal support, there are a few options. I mean, these aren't even all of them to be honest, but the top ones that we always recommend are the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota and Minnesota Legal Aid. They both have hotlines where you can ask any sorts of questions about immigration, especially after like an encounter with ICE. The other one that we recommend people to know about is the Minnesota Habeas Project. Basically, habeas corpus, for those who aren't as aware of it, means in the United States, you have the ability to petition the government and make them produce a reason that somebody is detained. There's a reason that their body is being held by the government. And often when it comes to immigration detention, that is how people can be released from immigration detention. Now, if you are out in community and if you are observing law enforcement activity and you are arrested for whatever reason, it is best to call the National Lawyers Guild in Minnesota. They're able to get people attorneys if they've been arrested while protesting or observing. So I always recommend that people have that number. I honestly, if I'm in a protest setting, I will just write it on my body somewhere. And then lastly, for both of them, reporting is really important when it comes to rights violations because we can't know people's rights are being violated if nobody tells us. So there's two places that we always try to get people to report that. One is, again, that ICE and feds form for, especially for federal instances. And then the other one is the Attorney General's website. They also collect examples of when federal agents have violated people's rights out in the community. All of these are going to be on the slides. All right, next slide. So one more quick interactive element before we're done with the training today. Like I said, we're trying to not just get this into your brains, but also kind of reinforce it. So try to think for a second. Do you remember those EJ+3 acronym? Now, first, next slide, EJ, election judge, and then the +3, election official, Minnesota Secretary of State office, 866 vote. Again, if you run into any issues while you're out voting, that's the ladder that you're going to follow. You're going to call the election judge, election official, Secretary of State, 866 vote, which includes our attorneys. So try to remember EJ+3. Next slide. Now, who remembers the 4+2 rights? Can you say any of them out loud at home? Okay, so we're going to go through them one more time. And again, I encourage people to say them out loud because the more times you say it out loud, the easier it will be when you are under a lot of stress. Next slide. Yes, okay, so number 1, am I being detained? Everyone. Number 2, I want to remain silent. Everyone. Number 3, I don't consent to a search. Number 4, I want to speak to an attorney. And then next slide. The last two, the two situational rights, I don't consent to your entry, everyone. And then I have the right to record in public. All right, good. Now you've all been trained on your rights. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a tiny bit of homework. So next slide. I know you didn't come into this expecting homework. One thing that we have learned at the ACLU is that by far, the most effective way for people to actually be able to assert these rights when their bodies are under a lot of pressure because they're in a stressful situation is to practice. Now, I know it can seem a little bit ridiculous, but the best way to keep yourself and your loved ones safe is to go home and role play these situations. Go home and role play the EJ+3. Have somebody pretend to be a heckler at the polls, and then you go through like, all right, these are the numbers I called. Or, the one that we've done for over a year now, have one person pretend to be an ICE agent, and, you can harass, yell at, just try to sweet talk, do whatever you can to get inside the other person's house who's playing, someone in their house. This seems silly, but what it will do is it will raise your blood pressure. It will make you have to think, oh, wait, how do I say this when somebody is like actively trying to violate my rights? Because again, it's one thing to know those rights, it's another thing to be able to produce them. So I deeply, deeply encourage all of you to go home and practice EJ+3, and 4+2. That's the best way that you're going to be able to assert those rights out in community and keep yourself and your neighbors safe this election season. Okay, next slide. I think now I'm going to hand it back over to Haley for our final Q&A.
Hello, friends. I see that David's been answering what constitutes public and private property in the chat, so please make sure that you're looking at that Q&A section. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, or not minutes, couple of seconds. Oh, yes, Dahlia, go ahead. Come off mute.
Yes, I have a question. If I have any concerns or questions about my voting process or polling place, where do I go to look? Becca, I'm looking at you.
I have an answer. Great first place is this Minnesota Secretary of State's office. They have pretty much anything you could think of. If you think they don't have it, look again, and then look a couple more times.
That's great. And then another question is, can you escort someone into the polling place if they are afraid? This person knows that they can't go into the booth with people, but can you escort them to the polling place? David, looking at you.
Yes, I think you can escort someone to the into the polling place if you are providing assistance to them in their voting process.
Thank you, David. And the next question I'm going to answer, do you have permission to share screenshots of the slides taken with your volunteer organization? I will do you all one better, and I will be sending out the slides as well as a link to the video recording of this training that we just did. And please do feel free to share widely. And as Becca said, make sure that you go to the Secretary of State's website if you need more information. I don't think this one is a question, but nope, you cannot campaign on the property if it is a public property. If that's a polling place and it's public property, no one can campaign on it. And that, I think, friends, I'm going to reiterate one more time. Keep on the lookout in your inbox for these slides and a link to the video for you to share it with your networks. And if you have any questions, go to the Secretary of State. Also, feel free to reach out to us at some of the hotlines that were put up. And with that, thank you so much to our presenters and our panelists for answering questions, and what a fantastic and informative session this was. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Enjoy your dinners if you haven't had dinner yet. Bye, friends.